So once again, we're still in the book of James, probably the second last sermon in James, so we are near the end. And I've called the message today, Don't Spoil the Harvest. Because if we look at what James begins to say here in chapter 5, verse 7, if you're wanting to look along, he begins by saying, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. If you can cast your mind back about 7 or 8 weeks when we began going through this book of James, you might remember one of the themes that has come up a few times through this letter is that of enduring and persevering. And here James begins a section that covers the importance of patience and the damage that comes from our impatience. There are many things that we need to endure that James has talked about: suffering, trials, persecution. But another thing that we need to endure is just the passing of time. As we face life and we have hopes and we have dreams and we have difficulties, we only ever live in the now. But sometimes we don't really live in the now, we live in the future because we long for a different now than we have now. So we live in that future, and the further away that future seems to be and the longer it seems to take us to get to that future, the more discontent we can become. And so patience is the ability to endure and to persevere in that passing of time. And like a good preacher, James has an analogy, an example to help make his point. I mean, in the life of a farmer, there are seasons of great activity and some seasons of waiting. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. What has been sown takes time to germinate, time to grow, to mature, and to ripen. Some of what is needed is completely out of the farmer's hands: the coming of the rains, for which they patiently wait. I mean, it makes sense. It might seem really obvious. I mean, after all, what can the farmer do but wait patiently? Well, sometimes perhaps they could be impatient and try to rush things, try to make the natural processes speed up in a way that, would bring a result more quickly, or they try to move to the next step before things are ready. I mean, there are all kinds of dangers of being impatient in farming. Someone might decide that, they can speed things up by over-fertilizing the crop, hoping that would accelerate its growth. But often, if you do too much of that, instead of healthier, faster-growing plants, they basically get burnt off in a way. The roots are damaged, the ground itself is damaged, and you might not have a more rapid harvest, you might have a delayed or even no harvest. If a farmer's too anxious and sows the seed too early, without waiting for the soil to be the right temperature and the timing of when the rains might be expected to be okay, then what is sown might fail to germinate. Or the plants might germinate, but there's still a late frost and they die off. Waiting patiently for the land to yield its crop. not trying to rush things or push things, because doing so could spoil the harvest. And while we might not, relate to farming, perhaps there's some of you here that enjoy cooking and that you've tried to follow some recipes to make certain dishes. And there are some dishes that are very famous for the fact that you need to be patient and wait. I've never tried to make a souffle, but the idea of that is, the stereotypical joke about the souffle is that you get a really flat one because the person didn't wait for the oven to be at the right temperature, and that they wanted to open the door and check or get it out too soon. And it just collapses, resulting in, a mush of batter, as I said on something. Or people might decide that, well, if it's going to take 3 hours to cook at 180, if I put it at 240, maybe it'll only take 2 hours. And that'd be great, except you might end up with something that's really burnt on the outside and raw on the inside, and that's spoiled it all as well. Some of you that really like rare steak are thinking, no, that looks good. But I don't know. Don't let impatience spoil the harvest. Some of you in sports, I didn't mean to look at you over here, but no, the frustration of there's an injury and you've got to wait. You've got to wait. You've got to wait to get back to it. If you're impatient and you rush it, before it's fully healed, the muscle strain will worsen. You might end up with more serious injuries and even longer recovery time. And never mind just injury, just the proper warm-up that you have to do. If you haven't done the warm-up properly before plunging into the intense activity, then you might do damage. Don't let impatience spoil the harvest. And those of us that aren't sporty or cooking or really good in the garden might even relate to just, you've bought some bananas or some fruit and you can't quite wait for it to get ripe. I did find a picture of someone eating a green banana, but it was so off-putting I wasn't going to force you to look at that. Some things are worth the wait. In fact, things that are worth having are often worth waiting for. And as I said, that might just seem perfectly obvious. Things take time. You just have to wait. Only a fool wouldn't know that. But the problem is, sadly, we can often be foolish. And I think it can begin as we're children, in the back seat of the car trip, with the impatience leading to the stereotypical, are we there yet? And we might laugh at that, but do we pull that from being a child into being an adult? I mean, James makes an interesting connection here. From being patient and waiting, he jumps into what I think is one of those results of impatience that we might not often realise is a result of impatience, and that is that we become grumblers. And James moves to this warning against grumbling. And it might seem, what do you mean, be patient, wait for the rains to come, don't grumble? But it follows. I mean, if you're remember the kids in the back seat, are we there yet? We carry that forward into our adult selves. If our expectations aren't being met, if our patience is being tried, it's just all too easy to grumble. I like this quote that I found somewhere. When unmet desire dissolves into discontent, we grumble. And I don't know if you notice, but there's a specific kind of grumbling that James targets. It's grumbling against one another. He's writing to the early church, but he could be writing to every church. Don't grumble against one another. With a warning, or you'll be judged. I mean, in the wider world, and we can think of various examples over the last 30 or 40 years, even over the last 5 or 10 years, the rush to judgment has often seen innocent people imprisoned and punished, only later to be vindicated. I think that's one reason here that the focus is a warning not to grumble against one another, because grumbling against one another sets us up as a judge of one another. And James says, don't judge, or you will be judged. And the judge, Jesus, is standing at the door. That's why we'll see later that James highlights compassion and mercy. But, this tendency to turn impatience into grumbling, is one we dislike it in others. And it's probably really easy, as I've been saying that, for you to all imagine a few people that you know that are grumblers. We dislike it in others, but we're often totally blind to it in ourselves. In others, we might talk about, they just moan a lot, or they whinge, they complain, or good biblical word is they murmur, the murmurers. And we dislike it in others, but we're often blind to it in ourselves because we don't do those things. We're just expressing concerns. Or we're critiquing. Perhaps we're sharing frustrations. Or here's one, we're just questioning things. Asking questions is fine. Questioning things is different. You might think, again, Chris, you're just being fussy about words. But in one, questioning things, you just want to point out something you don't like or are unhappy about. You're not really wanting an answer. You're just questioning it because you want to say the question, because saying the question is a way to get your grumble out there. But you can feel good about it. But asking questions is okay and different when you genuinely want to know an answer. So does that mean that you can't ever be unhappy about something? Or that there's never a valid complaint? No. But there's a line between an expression of sorrow or a grievance that we might have and an expression of our ingratitude and our impatience. The Bible is full of something that you might read it and think, gee, they sound like they're complaining. But the technical word would be that they are psalms or cries of lament. And again, Chris, you're being fussy about words. Well, lament is a cry of belief in a good God who transfigures the ugly into the beautiful. You recognise that that's who God is, and you are lamenting that you're seeing the ugliness and the pain and the problem. It's a passionate expression of grief or sorrow, whereas a complaint is an expression of dissatisfaction or annoyance about a state of affairs or an event. And the Bible has lots of accounts of lament, but it also has lots of accounts of complaint. And God listens to one, well, actually listens to the other as well, but his response in each case is kind of different. In James 5:9 it says, don't grumble against one another, back in Numbers in the story of Exodus. And the Israelites, they were experienced grumblers. One of the commentaries I read had a good description of the Israelites were experienced grumblers. They could put that on their resume. Lots of experience at being grumblers and being impatient. They'd just been let out of slavery, for goodness sake. They were on their way to the promised land. But boy, could they grumble. Boy, could they be impatient. It didn't get them there any faster. In fact, they ended up taking much longer, 40 years in the wilderness. And at one stage, we read this. God say, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? I've heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. We'll look at what he did after he heard them in a little minute. Now, in the Exodus story, the Israelites wanted things that were of themselves good things. They wanted food and water. They wanted safe passage to the promised land. They wanted a degree of comfort and security. But they wanted them on their own terms and in their own time. And in a way, their grumbling, their murmuring, showed that they valued those things more than they valued the God who was with them. Remember the pillar of fire and cloud? What he had done, God was with them. These things they wanted were good things of themselves. And if they knew the God that was with them, they would trust that he's a God who's going to provide good things for those he cares for. But they had an expectation. They had a desire that wasn't being met. Jesus himself gives a warning to his followers. Stop grumbling amongst yourselves, Jesus answered. One of the other little letters in the end of the New Testament talks about people. These men are grumblers and fault finders. They follow their own evil desires. The danger with grumbling is that we may become a grumble, as the little Mr. Men there might suggest. It's what he's known as. There's a quote by C.S. Lewis which talks about the danger of getting into the habit of grumbling. And he said that hell often begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming others. But you're still distinct from it. You recognise that you're grumbling and complaining. And you might not be that comfortable with the fact that you're grumbling and complaining. You might not like it. You might criticise that about yourself and wish that you could stop it. But there might come a day when you can no longer stop it. Because there's no you left to criticise your own criticisms and grumbling. And there's nothing left but the grumble itself going on forever like a machine. In The Great Divorce, he tells a wonderful story of that, of someone that person's saying, but is that person really that wicked? Aren't they just grumbling? And the person says, well, it depends, I guess, whether they're just grumbling or whether they've become a grumble. And sort of explains the difference there. He goes on to say, in each of us there will be something growing which will be hell unless it's nipped in the bud. God doesn't have to send us to hell, he just leaves us to what we become when we turn away from him. And you know, the interesting thing is, people will grumble about something, often the very same thing that others will express gratitude and appreciation for. It's very confusing. And you've got to think, well, what's different? And in both cases, they might desire similar things and recognise that they're perhaps not being met, or they might have different desires or different expectations. If you've got an unmet desire that becomes an unmet expectation that then becomes an unmet demand, we're suddenly elevating ourselves to a position of wanting to dictate to God and circumstances and everything, and that can become a problem. I found something really interesting on an unexpected place when I was just Googling and looking for comments and quotes about this, and a website called Australian Disaster Relief had a sermon uploaded that had this article on the dangers of grumbling and complaining, and it talks about how murmuring and grumbling, I missed a word there, it cuts off your vision for the future. It breeds doubt for the fact that God's good in your present and wants to be good in your present. It's something that has a life of its own. Once you let it begin, it deepens and it grows, and it can even become self-fulfilling. The grumbling, the criticisms, the complaints can become self-fulfilling, inviting and creating adversity. And the Bible even suggests that one of the problems with complaining too much is God might actually say, well, if that's what you think's going on, great, that's what you can have. Back again in this story from Exodus, where we got that quote a minute ago, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, how long will this wicked community grumble against me? I've heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites, so I better hop to it and do exactly what they want. No, he said, I've heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites, so tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. They were grumbling and saying, oh, we haven't got enough food, we're taking too long, we're going to die out here in the desert. God basically says, I've heard you grumbling, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you who's grumbled against me. I try to avoid preaching on verses like that. Let's move on. That's not a very nice one. Remember this guy I quoted a while back who said, when unmet desire dissolves into discontent, we grumble. I like this other thing he said as well. He said, when unmet desire draws us to God, we worship. Two people might have the same desire, the same expectation that is not being met. Yet in one it dissolves into discontent and grumbling. In the other, it causes them to press in to God. I think it's why when we read the Bible, we find these verses that can seem a bit tricky. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God. That we don't give in to that temptation, that we don't follow the voice of the enemy urging us into that, but instead we press into God, who is blameless and pure. And as we do so, we become more like that voice that we listen to. You know, and the thing is, there's just so much misery in the world and in some lives because we just want something to be more or different than what we have. And we let that rob us of the joy of all the good things that we do have. I might want something to be different than what I've got. And if I focus on that, and that's all that I've got before my eyes, I can have that discontent grow so much that I can forget that I have a wife that's beautiful and lovely to me, a daughter that I care about, who cares about me, that I can enjoy singing songs and doing things that I love. Those things that bring me great joy. And yes, that hasn't undone the fact that I've got an unmet desire, an unmet expectation. But the focus of my life, where does it go? Another guy I found had an interesting quote. He was from a Church of Christ somewhere in America. He said, sadly, murmuring is one of the most prevalent sins amongst some churches. Those who would never think of committing adultery or murder are guilty of this sin. Some who have the highest morals, adhere most closely to doctrine, and are most generous in their giving, negate all the good things they do by whining. As he says up here, joy is not having everything you want. Joy is being thankful for everything you have. If you're wondering where joy comes into it, remember back to the first sermon we did on James, and Vanessa mentioned it last week. James 1, 2-3. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And so James goes on here in 5 to talk about what we should have instead of impatience leading to grumbling and criticism and judging. As you know, he said, we count as blessed those who've persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and seen what the Lord finally brought about. We're encouraged to be patient, to seek out joy even in the things that we have to endure, to persevere. Our resistance against the onslaught of things that otherwise might try to stop us in our tracks. Again, back to James 1, perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And then this little section in James 5, James just tucks in this great truth. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Talking to people that have a tendency to be impatient, to be critical of one another, to be judgmental, to want to give up, to want to rush things through. Then he contrasts that and says, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. As we head into the last few months of me being here preaching, I like that James brings out again one of the key themes that I've tried to make of my entire time here. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. There's like at least a dozen verses in the Bible where that comes out. It starts when Moses asks God to show himself to him. And God shows himself to Moses and declares, "This is who I am. The Lord full of gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love." If you feel the temptation to grumble, if I feel the temptation to grumble, if you're feeling that it's difficult to be patient and to persevere, if I'm finding it hard to persevere, I hope that, that phrase that I've said many times in the last 5 years might continue to come to our minds, and we would discover the power that is in them, being reminded that whatever is going on, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy, and God is with us here. When you have before your mind, before your heart, and before your spirit the truth and revelation of God like this, how different our lives can be. As I said there, some things are worth waiting for. Those Israelites, they were on the way to the promised land. It was delayed, and they didn't get there. Let's not act in ways that delay us getting to where God would seek to take us. Let me pray, and the musicians can come back up. Lord, thank you that this is how you chose to reveal yourself to Moses, with the desire that he would come down from that mountain and speak to all those people who had come out of Egypt and say, "This is the Lord that is with us, that we are following, the Lord gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love." And Lord, the scary thing is that we read through the history of what went on back then and discover that while you are slow to anger, they managed to anger you. Lord, might we not anger you in any way. Might we always be reminded that you are full of compassion and mercy, that we would allow that to flow into our lives, that unmet desires would not dissolve into discontent, but unmet desires would draw us to you, to praise, to honour. Lord, thank you for the fact that your word is not one that just challenges us to berate us in any way for those things that we tend to do wrong, but that always ends with a promise of the goodness that you want to pour on us instead. Lord, in the next few weeks, we'll probably get to that verse that talks about how you've given us everything we need for life and godliness. Lord, thank you for what you have given us here and now.